Some of you have asked me about copper because in my book, How to Profit from the Coronavirus Recession, one of the companies featured was a copper company. So I wanted to interview someone about the copper thesis as a commodity, not a specific company. And the guest today that I interviewed, his name is Gianni Kovacevic, and he has a lot of presentations on YouTube on copper, and he also wrote a book, My Electrician Drives a Porsche. So I thought it was a perfect time to bring him up and talk about copper. Now, one thing that I want to say is that we are talking about copper. He also mentioned the way he plays copper, which is through a company called Copper Bank, and he talked a little bit about Copper Bank. And for full disclosure, I don't own Copper Bank. I didn't do any research on Copper Bank, so I know a lot of you might ask me, what do I think about it? I don't know. I have no opinion, positive or negative. I just simply do any work on it. So I just wanted to, throw it out there so that you know where I stand on it. Now let's go ahead and jump into the interview. Welcome to Classic Value Investors. My name is Mariusz Skonieczny, and I'm very excited today. I am interviewing Gianni Kovacevic. Gianni, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me on, Mariusz. And you have an interesting last name like myself. And for those people listening throughout the English world, my last name is very simple. It means blacksmith. So in that part of the world where I come from, Croatia, a Kovac is the traditional word for blacksmith. So almost every Croatian person, Serbo-Croatian person, has the avic at the end. So it's simply Kovacevic, which means blacksmith. My name in English would be John Blacksmith.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So Croatia. I mean, okay, Croatia. I'm from Poland, so we got some, similarities. I can't help but to ask you, did you watch The Last Dance and Tony Kukoc being in it?
Absolutely. It's amazing. It's one of these things like Titanic, where you know the ending. However, it's the journey to get there and all the backstories and what's going on. It's just fascinating. It's 10 hours of just incredible nostalgia for anyone that of that era that was there live. And me graduating high school in 1992, that was my time to watch pro basketball. It was fantastic.
So when you graduated high school, you were in Croatia at that point, I assume?
No, I was already in Vancouver. So I was born in Vancouver. I went back to what was Tito's Yugoslavia back in those days, lived at my grandfather's farm, but came back for grade school and school. That's why I speak, let's say, pretty good American English.
Okay. I know most people know Tony Kukoc because he was playing with Jordan, but I know I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of this guy, but there was another player that was just he played for the Nets and then he died in a car accident.
Dražen
Yeah.
Petrovic.
Yeah, I mean he was really he was much better than all of them. He was like
Yeah,
the
he was a
legend.
star.
Yeah.
He was a star. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I know they talked about him a little bit in The Last Dance, but I personally also have a story because I'm a little bit younger than you, but
Hmm.
I graduated high school in 1999, but also grew up with Jordan,
Yeah.
when I was a kid, and I'll send you a link to my article because I just wrote. An article titled "His Last Dance Was My Last Dance," and what I meant by it is, you see, when I was coming from Poland to the United States, it was 1996, and that's
Hmm.
when he was at his prime,
Hmm.
and I was so into basketball, and that's all I wanted to do was just play basketball. And when I got to the U.S., I did make the basketball team on my high school team, but because of the language and my skills weren't up to par at that point, I never really played. So it was
Hmm.
really so devastating to me at that point, and that's when I stopped playing basketball and started dancing. So that's when I said his last dance was literally my first.
Oh, interesting. And
Yeah,
you come from Indiana, which got a long and famous history with
that's right.
with particularly collegiate basketball. So
That's right.
you're in the right place to
Yeah.
do it.
All right. So that's enough of a little bit of introduction here. I wanted to bring you on because you, you're an expert in energy, and I listened to a lot of your videos on copper. And when I was studying copper, actually, I listened to your interviews, and I also read your book titled "My Electrician Drives a Porsche." And so, let's talk a little bit about, I mean, what makes you special? Why are you qualified to talk about copper? And let's talk about copper.
Absolutely. There's a little bit of crackling in the background. Is that your headset or mine?
Is it still going on?
Now it's went away now. Yep.
Maybe it was my
Okay.
chair.
Oh, could be. Okay. Um, yes. What makes me so qualified to talk about copper? That's interesting. Opening point. So I followed energy for the past 25 years, but even before that, you you look at the what is energy? It's the way that industry and government uh, provide energy that we in society and industry use it. And it's predominantly fossil fuels, which is overwhelmingly led by oil and gas, coal, nuclear power, and every other way that electricity can be created and utilized. So Nikola Tesla was born in Croatia. He was a Serbian, but born in Gospic, Croatia. And anyone that comes from that part of the world would be fascinated at the genius of this person and what he did for mankind. He was the person who literally invented alternating current, which is why we can have uh, large motors that utilize high voltage power, and we can create high voltage power, and it can be moved thousands of miles across a country to be generated in one place and utilized in another place. And we are right now at a pivot where all of these, the way energy, all these things in the energy sphere is going through a hinge of history, which is a very broad statement. It takes many years to play out. And within this hinge of history, there's going to be fantastic opportunity. And there's also going to be collateral damage. You have to go back, I will suggest to people, 100 years for the last hinge of history, and before that would have been in the late 1880s. And the two I'm talking about before was of course the internal combustion engine, when we started to discover oil in vast quantities, and that was refined into things like gasoline and kerosene, which we use to enable the internal combustion engine. But before that, what it was for energy was illumination. How do we light up the world? Well, I'm talking about the 1870s, 1880s, and the commercialization of the light bulb occurred in 1882, roughly, when Thomas Edison, who was sponsored financially by John Pierpont Morgan, and they were able to create the idea that you could commercialize lighting. And many people thought it would take a long time. It happened very quickly, as everyone should know by now, and it was disrupting the way energy was going to be sourced in the future. So that was a hinge of history, the 1880s with the light bulb. Um, in the early 1900s, when the commercialization of the internal combustion engine for automobiles and everything else, including airplanes and later on railroads would transition, and the naval fleets would go from coal to diesel in the early 1900s. And it's been that way all the way until this renewable energy renaissance, which got off to a very slow start because often people will overestimate what technology and innovation can do in the short run, but we always underestimate what it does in the long run. And we are now at the point where I will submit to people in the strongest possible way that that hinge of history has already occurred. When you can have an electric car or electric truck or electric bus, and you can make the energy with solar and wind, augmented by batteries and or natural gas because it's immediate, and you can build these things actually with solar power. You don't need the fossil fuels per se. Fossil fuels are important to make steel and fertilizers and cement and other things. But even that too is changing with hydrogen and so many different things colliding. And it all comes to one key word, and it's electrification. It's the magnificence of electrification that makes it all possible. So you need to understand in full color, and it's a huge process of learning for anyone that is not familiar with electrification. But anytime that you talk about renewable energy or green energy or all these things that you hear about in the news, which is now going through this hinge of history, it is enabled by copper. There is no substitute. It's done with two things: aluminum and copper. And copper is the ideal conductor because of its cost. It's far lower resistivity than aluminum because aluminum it costs less, but it's very inefficient, and it does not work for a lot of applications, particularly with modern energy schemes. But it will be done with both aluminum and copper, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next few minutes to really get people's imagination going on where they can look at and why copper is so magnificent.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. So, okay, so where are we currently with, the supply and demand? Because I found it particularly interesting in your presentations how you talked about supply of copper and how it actually compares to how the supply picture looks in terms of quantity of producers for oil. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. A commodity is something that is supplied and it's utilized. And if people stop using a certain commodity, it doesn't need to be supplied as much. We've seen that famously played out in the oil market here in early 2020 due to this slowdown of global economic activity because of this COVID virus. And it was a stress test on the demand of oil. We were always prognosticating when would we have a fall in demand in oil, and this is because of all the different things people read about. If everyone starts driving electric cars and buses, obviously you're going to use less oil, and that people were forecasting this would happen in 2030 or 2040. The stress test that occurred here in the first quarter and second quarter of 2020 was effectively eliminating as much as 30 million barrels of oil demand per day instantly. And for those that are not aware, we were using about 100 million barrels of oil a day at the end of 2019, which has consistently climbed over the past 120 years. So it's a commodity, like all commodities. And there's a famous rule for commodity investing. Running out of a commodity does not matter until it matters, and then it matters a lot. Because when you have a shortage, all of a sudden you have a price reaction. But because it is a commodity, it makes logical sense for the speculators, investors, the large traders of the world, that when the price goes much higher because of a shortage, you inevitably have the hangover where it's oversupplied or it becomes too expensive and people stop using that commodity and they start transitioning into other things. And you could go back over 100 years and it's reliable as reliable can be. And this is indoctrined to the thinking and the methodology of investors, traders, and speculators around the world. And copper is no different, that when you go through a bust cycle, you get a boom cycle, and it repeats over and over and over. Except this time, to use the words of Sir John Templeton, who, once upon a time said, the four most dangerous words in investing is this time it's different. But because we're going through a hinge of history and the understanding of the old rule books of the relationships between oil and gold, that ratio, and oil and copper, and the thinking of the CAGR growth rate of demand and where they're procured and how industry has made advancements in the way we extract oil from different formations around the world, how we discover or explore for new sources of oil, and most importantly, that does not coincide with the lack of discovery success in copper, the grade or the quality of the ore bodies for the future of copper, and that is colliding with, as I'll demonstrate in the next few minutes, there is going to be significant new demand growth for copper and copper only, separate to all other commodities, other than the lesser ones. If you look at critical elements for batteries and stuff, those are different. But I'm talking of the large commodities. The strongest CAGR growth rate is going to be, in my view, copper, where we will see it growing by as much as 4 or 5% per year, because it's incalculable in every facet of the global economy, from the smallest rural village in Africa to the streets of New York City. we are going to be using more copper per application, per capita, per person, as this massive wave in this hinge of history is the way energy is produced, transferred, and utilized by society and industry with all these different applications. And that is going to a lot of the models are going to be wrong because people are simply ignorant to how electrification works and the power of magnitude more copper that's required for every application as we go through those different applications, which we will in the next few minutes.
Okay, and how does the supply picture of copper look? I mean, how many producers are there? And, what's going on that side?
Well, we're going to continue to compare the oil industry with the copper industry. And I'll just say it because every time we go away from fossil fuels, predominantly transportation fuels, kerosene, diesel, gasoline, this is used in heavy trucks, in trains, airplanes, and the passenger vehicles that we drive around the world. Why do I say that? Because the very thing that makes it possible, without using too much imagination, it becomes a electric vehicle, or it becomes a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle. And hydrogen fuel cell is still an electric car. The battery is the hydrogen fuel cell, but everything else is electric. So the average electric vehicle uses about 400% more copper per application. Okay, that's simple. But the way we source electricity in the first place for industry, which is coal, natural gas, nuclear, or renewables. So this is definitively happening around the world, where the cheapest form of new energy, electrical energy, in almost every jurisdiction is now solar and wind, or a combination, augmented by natural gas because it's instantaneous when the sun doesn't shine and when the wind doesn't blow. When you create a scheme like this, where you're building at the 1,000 megawatt or 1 gigawatt scale, which is a huge power plant that could power an entire city, it takes approximately 1 ton of copper to build a conventional thermal megawatt of power. When you get into the more modern schemes of solar and wind, it's 4 to 6 tons of copper per megawatt. And when we're talking about offshore wind, which is a huge growth sector around in certain areas that have that kind of capacity, it's 10 times more copper for each megawatt. So people should look at this as an inverse graph. Every single time that society goes away from fossil fuels, particularly transportation fuels, you're losing the oil demand, but you're gaining in copper demand, because we're now using something, or we're building something that's going to require more copper to operate, function, and to recharge it over and over, week by week, year by year, for the rest of your life, really. So they are different, the characteristics of them. So now we have to look at, and if I just do it a bit of a run-on sentence, so people have a deep appreciation, where does the world's oil supply come from? And that is going to be impacted, and that will superimpose that to where does the world's copper supply come from? Because the copper supply is going to be impacted because there's going to be more demand, and it's going to be hard for copper suppliers to keep up unless the price goes higher. Whereas in the oil business, just as we've seen right now in the last 2 months, it's going to be a fight for who sells the last barrel. It's going to be, the oil business will be good for the rest of your life. It's going to be compressed, and it's going to be a race to make a profit with the end product, where there could be scenarios in the distant future where you actually give a barrel of oil away for free to a refiner, and you share in the profit of what can be made from that barrel of oil. And that's where the money is made. But if you look at the most landlocked, highest regulated, most energy intensive barrels of oil that are stuck in the ground, they will be assets that are abandoned. They simply will not be extracted, because assets that are deemed uneconomic are assets that will be stranded. And if people can do their own research. I simply have no interest in investing in that sector, because I don't want to have to be clever enough to follow what's going to be a winning business and what's going to be a losing business. I will liken the oil industry to like tobacco. Tobacco has been a terrible new industry to get involved with for the past 30 years. Yet for those that are already in it, that set the margin, it's been a very good business. So it will be for places like Russia and places like Saudi Arabia and Dubai and the UAE and Iraq and Iran. It will be a decent business for them, because they will be the price setters in that margin. So do you have a secondary question perhaps before I get into the copper supplies to really articulate where these things come from?
No, I would like you to go into this copper supply.
Okay. Now you're going to forgive me, but I have to explain to people where the oil supply number by number comes from and why it's changed so much. So just to give you the basic numbers, the world's oil supply comes globally from the smallest little well to the largest producers in Saudi Arabia from 4,700,000 individual wells. So it's a huge supply chain from dozens of countries that actually produce this product. The copper industry is a little different. There are 25 major copper mines that give us 50% of primary copper production. And most of these mines were actually discovered, 70, 80, 100 years ago. We still rely on the old legacy mines in Arizona, in Chile, and elsewhere in the world, but it's a lot more constrained. So, and the oil and gas industry, not only does it come from that many places, the 4,700,000 wells, they reinvented the wheel. The extraction of oil has changed because of innovation and technology. And we have not seen that occur as much in copper. So if you look at the history of horizontal fracking, which was effectively the merger of two companies, Devon Energy, which was doing horizontal drilling in Oklahoma, and Mitchell Energy, which was doing vertical drilling for gas north of Dallas, Texas, and they were fracking it. They merged the two companies in 2002. They would drill 7 wells, horizontal frac wells for gas in 2002. They did around 55 in 2003, but then the industry latched on to that type of extraction in the shale formations. They transitioned to the oil business around 08, 09, 2010. And by the time we got to 2015, the industry had done 150,000 horizontal frac wells, reinventing the wheel, which is why in late 2014 at the OPEC meeting, Saudi Arabia effectively said we're no longer the swing producer. That's the first oil price collapse, which resulted in a dramatic fall in oil in 2015. And then they became more efficient. And now you've had the second collapse of the oil price, which happened in early March when once again Russia decided to leave the OPEC Plus partnership, where they're saying, let's get on with it. We're going to be the last producer of choice, you and Saudi Arabia, but we cannot artificially keep the oil price high so that these shale producers are actually making a margin. They reinvented the wheel. There has been no such innovation in the copper industry. Hasn't happened. The copper is derived from mining ore, and there simply is no copper content in the rock. We are now mining 0.6% copper content at the legacy mines, if you put them in aggregate, around the top 15 copper producers. It used to be in excess of 1%. So picture in the theater of your mind, if you have a ton of rock, which would be approximately 2.5 meters by 2.5 meters by 2.5 meters, a block, there is only less than there's about 0.6% copper content. They have to crush all that rock, process it, concentrate it so that it's a higher grade, around 30% roughly. And then that concentrated material has to leave Peru or Chile and go to Japan or mostly China. China is the biggest refiner of copper in the world at this point. And then it's once again reprocessed and turned into things like a cable and transformer windings and what have you, and sent around the world. We spent looking in the R&D exploration of copper during the China supercycle in the last 15 years, about $100 billion exploring to find more copper. There was no big success stories. There's the odd outlier, like what Robert Friedland found in the Congo, which is very high grade. But generally speaking, if you look at the 50 largest development projects, so these are projects that are not mines, but they're future mines, the average grade of these projects is going to be 0.4% copper or even lower than that. That's the future of the copper industry. There simply is no copper in the rock anymore. So we found all the high-grade deposits at surface. They're going to be deeper. They're going to have a waste rock above it. You're going to have to dig that away before you get to the actual the resource. And there's only one variable that's going to help us here, Mariusz. In my view, it's the engineering. And the engineering tells us that if you want to be able to extract that copper with a profit, we are going to see what should be new all-time highs in the copper price. And it has nothing to do with the old ratios and the old thinking and the old rule book and all the things I just talked about. We're going to have very strong demand for copper, so the business is going to be good. So if you're making cable or transformers or motors, you will pay more for copper because you're selling many of those things. This will translate eventually to the people that actually extract the copper, because right now they're telling the world we cannot build a new copper mine at this copper price. It's not economic. There's no incentive. There's no banker that's going to lend us the money to do it. So it's an insurance policy, or I think it's inevitable. Either we don't use more copper, which means they found some substitute for the future of energy in this hinge of history, which I don't believe is the case. There is nothing to substitute away. And by the way, copper is very cheap. It's $5 a kilogram or $2.50 a pound. It's an extremely cheap for the utility that it provides. And with that, it's going to have a serious price reaction, and that's going to destroy the traditional ratios. Because if you look at a price graph over the past 20 or 30 years, copper has over 90% of the time has followed the oil price. That will not work anymore because the oil price, other than politics, I don't see it racing back up to $100 a barrel. It could do that for a short period of time because of politics, not because of fundamentals. And we've already seen the gold to oil ratio break down definitively. That used to be 16 to 24 barrels of oil to buy 1 ounce of gold. It is now 70 barrels of oil to buy 1 ounce of gold. And I am not going to bet against gold. So I don't see that ratio coming back together for a very long time, the oil to gold ratio, which fortifies this relationship that I believe you're going to see a breakdown of the copper to oil ratio. And it's going to break all the models that people traditionally use for commodities, where copper should follow oil. It won't. And in fact, there's going to come a day where you're going to see copper on the front page of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. The future of energy is copper because of every single facet, from the smallest village in Africa to the streets of New York City, is all going to be facilitated, enabled by electrification and a power of magnitude more copper per application. And that is where, if you're a speculator, fortunes can be made.
Interesting. I'm glad you were talking about copper grade. I know that, for the 20 years ago or so, um, or even very close to up to now, uh, you have a ton of ore,
Mm-hmm.
and like you said, within that ore, they used to mine 1%.
Even better
So,
than 1%. Used to
right,
be 2% once
right,
upon a
right,
time.
right. Years ago, it was 2%. Then we depleted that, and then we had to go for 1%. And now what you're saying is that the future of copper has to go to 0.4%. So just to put these things into perspective, if let's say you have 1 ton, and you're a business person, you have 1 ton of ore, and uh, with within that ton of ore, you have, let's just say 1% for now. You have 1% of copper. So that ton of ore is worth, I believe in one of your presentations you said it's like a $60 ton. Am I right?
Yeah, let me give this to people that, whether you're a mining engineer listening or whether you're a school teacher that doesn't know a lot about mining. The biggest copper mines in the world are in Chile. Okay, so everyone's seen on TV a huge mining truck. These things, if you put a school bus next to the tire of the mining truck, so people can have that kind of scale. These things are gigantic. They're like mountains. And what they do is they put all the ore, the rocks, in that big dump truck, and it goes to be processed, to be crushed again, and processed to get that, as you say, 0.6% of that rock is only copper. So if you're mining in Chile, you used to mine 30 million tons of rock. That's a mountain of rock every year. When the grade falls from 1% to 0.6%, you now need to mine 50, 20 million tons more for the same metal yield. When I know it sounds like not a big deal going from 1% to 0.6% copper concentrate, but in a mining perspective, it is it's huge. Tens
Well,
of millions of tons of rock more have to be mined.
Well,
So
Johnny, it's. Let me just. I mean, yeah, it might not sound like a big deal, but let's say you have any business. I don't care what it is. If your revenues are 60 and your expenses are, let's say, 40, and all of a sudden your revenue goes from 60 to 30 and your expenses are still 40, it's a big deal.
it's an extremely big deal. So what's going to save the day for the copper mining industry? Well, like the oil and gas industry, there are areas where technology and innovation can help the existing deposits to make them more efficient. There is some inefficiencies that can be corrected. And there are some forecasts that are saying from the existing mines, we can get 10 or 20% more output by implementing over the next 5 or 10 or 15 years a huge wave of innovation to get more copper from the existing ore that we have. And there is some argument that this will occur. There will be some appreciation. However, what I'm talking about is the CAGR growth rate, the demand for copper growing by 3, 4, 5%. And if you implement the rule of 72 into that interest rate, the demand for copper will roughly double in the next 20 to 25 years. So this innovation is peanuts in the scale of what will come. So the denominator, it's going to have to be a higher copper price because the engineering simply doesn't allow it. And here's the math. So copper trades for $2.40 as we speak today on May 28th, 2020. On the LME, that's about 5,000 some odd dollars per ton. If the concentrate grade is 1%, based on the LME price per ton, that would tell you that a ton is worth about $50, $55. But of course, the grade isn't 1%, it's 0.5%. So now it's worth $25 a ton. But the future grade of copper is even lower than that. We're talking about doing a feasibility study, which you do not have to spend tens of millions of dollars doing because you know on the back of a napkin, it just doesn't work. You're left with, at 0.4% copper grades, with, based on the LME price today, about $20 a ton. That's the margin that you have for a future business. It doesn't work. You don't need to do the feasibility and will not be economic at these copper prices. But you don't even get that. You have recoveries of 90% typically with the copper porphyries. You don't get everything. You lose some along the way. Now you've got $18. Then you have to pay penalties, treatment charges, refining charges, transportation. You lose some along the way. And then you have to finance. You have to build a large copper mine. To build a copper mine in the Andes is costing between $3 and $7 billion. You have to pay this back. There simply is no margin. If you look at this example I just gave you, you're left with a loss. So what's the only thing that can help this equation? If the copper price goes, what the engineers are telling us, we have to make a ton of 0.4% copper ore economic, which tells me the copper price has to go to about $10,000 or $12,000 a ton, which would be a new all-time high. Or effectively, if you use the oil and copper ratio, imagine if oil prices were to go back to $150 a barrel. It would be euphoria in the streets of Texas or in Houston, Calgary, and Riyadh. I don't see that scenario happening for oil, but I'm telling you, it's not an if question. It's a when. When will copper prices crest a new all-time high? It's going to happen in the next years because you're going to have very strong demand, and you're going to have the only way miners are going to be able to bring that ore to market is to make it economic based on a feasibility study, which tells us we're going to have a new all-time high. And it's going to happen, I believe, a lot quicker than most people think, because guess what's going to happen with the in excess of $10 trillion of stimulus in a post-COVID world? It's going to go into modern infrastructure, new infrastructure, Green New Deal, call it what you will. In China, in Europe, in a large part of the United States, they're going to be accelerating plans and development, a huge development of renewable energy, green energy, electrified transportation schemes. So what should have taken place in the next 10 or 20 years, I will submit to people, is going to start happening a lot sooner than they think, which means it's going to be a very good business to make transformers, cables, and motors, which is going to reverberate into them buying more copper, which is going to be a massive supply deficit, and the price of copper, in my view, is going to be actually a mania where, like I said before, you're going to find it on the front page of Barron's, you're going to find it on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And as my friend Don Cox would always tell a speculator, never invest in the story on page one. That's the efficient market. Invest in the story that's on page 16 in the bottom corner, that's headed to page one above the fold. So now is the time to familiarize yourself with copper, understand where the opportunity is, and allocate a responsible, reasonable amount of money into different copper investment ideas. Because I think that's where you're going to see outperformance in the next 2, 5, 10 years.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Before the coronavirus, the copper price was just about to reach $3 per pound, and then boom, coronavirus happens. How did this virus affect the demand and supply in the short term? And you already started talking about the repercussions of it, but let's just rewind a little bit.
Yeah. Well, people have to use a bit of common sense. So the copper price was still it wasn't an area that people could build new copper mines, but also the supply demand differential. I'm talking before COVID, so let's go back to January. There was some anticipation because of the resolution of phase one of the China-USA trade tariff deal that business was going to improve in this trade for global CEOs to say, okay, we can now reinvest in our businesses because we have a little more clarity on where the supply chain is going to be disrupted. And the price of copper reacted until COVID occurred. And what COVID did, which is an unprecedented stop to the business cycle, it makes total logical sense that anyone, anywhere who was doing anything, they stopped procuring material. And this coincided with the Chinese New Year, which in general always has a bit of a stop of the business cycle because they're the biggest buyer of all commodities, the Chinese. But this happened together with COVID this year. So it really was like the music stopped. Everyone stopped procuring the raw materials to make things. And so obviously the price collapsed, like it did on many different commodities because people stopped buying them. But what's often forgotten, it's not just about demand. The supply also was curtailed. So by the time you got to March, and Peru basically shut off all mining, and Peru produces 10% of the world's copper. Chile had shut down some major mines. Panama shut down what is now the fourth or fifth largest copper mine in the world. And also production was curtailed around the world because of COVID precautions. So it almost balanced the market. Yes, demand collapsed, but supply also came down with it so that it still became, I think the price did a lot better than most people thought. Certainly it didn't collapse like the oil price because people totally stopped using oil. And unlike copper is fungible, so is oil. It can be stored for a long period of time, but we don't have huge daily inventory security measures like we do for oil. Like Japan has 250 days of oil in storage. China has over 1 billion of barrels of oil in storage. America has 700 million barrels of oil in storage for emergency measures. Most people only have 5 or 10 or 15 days of copper. And right now we've seen global warehouses, I'm talking Shanghai, LME, New York, it climbed from about 400,000 tons to 650, and it's now back to 500,000 tons. Why? Because they stopped producing copper in concert with a fall in demand. So we have 500,000 tons of copper metal, and we use every single day 45,000 tons of copper. So we have about 12 days of global demand in those inventories between Shanghai, LME, the LME warehouses around the world, and COMEX. That's not a lot. So when the business cycle turns on again and people start to get greedy and the speculators come in and say, you know what, the one part of the economy that's getting a lot of attention and a lot of the stimulus packages is electrification and renewable energy schemes. Those people are going to start taking a little bit more out of warehouses, and I believe you're going to have, yet again, a shortage. And that's going to happen. It's happening in real time. So that's what's happened with the price of copper over the past sort of 90, 120 days. I will say it survived what was a demand collapse because supply came down with it. And it's, already at this copper price, about 5% of copper producers don't make money. You could even argue 10% of the world's copper producers do not turn a profit at 230 copper.
Okay. Wow, that's interesting. Um, okay, so that's how the COVID affected it, and then the restart is what you were talking about, and then you also talked about, the long-term picture. So that's absolutely perfect. Now, can we talk a little bit about? I want you to talk about your book a little bit. My electrician drive a Porsche, because like what's in the book? What made you want to write it? I do want people to be aware of it.
Well, I wrote a book to solidify my thought process. It's very hard for me to have a 5-hour dinner with a lot of people. So often people will write a book so they can put down a story or their ideas or their thinking of a very complex strategy or theme. My book is titled "My Electrician Drives a Porsche," and it's written like a novel. So it's an adventure between two people, and it's a young electrician who takes his family doctor, who's a baby boomer, on a journey of enlightenment to appreciate the magnificence of electrification and what it takes to make it possible. And kind of what we talked about through today's discussion, but it also is fortified by emerging markets, because the subtitle of the book is Investing in the Rise of a New Spending Class, which is this army of new consumers that's not just China. It's in Indonesia, it's in Thailand, it's in Mexico, it's around the world, where people are now, demonstrably better off than they were 20 and 30 years ago. You could argue 2 or 3 billion people have been taken out of abject poverty in the past 30 years. They now have an economic footprint that's more similar to you and I. Because when they buy a car, and the commodities that it takes to make the car or to operate the car, or the electrification and having a refrigerator and air conditioning and all those other things, it takes commodities. So that is going to be a fortifier that yet again delivers reliable CAGR growth rate, especially over the next 30 years, where population will still grow. You can argue after that birth rates fall and there's going to be less people. That's fine. But for the context of what I'm talking about investing in right now, electrification and the enablers of electrification, you're going to see population grow through this decade and the next one, more people consuming more things. So you can look at this book, which is not stale dated. It was published a couple of years ago, but all the themes are as relevant, if not more relevant today than they were then. And it's a page turner. You could be a 14-year-old schoolgirl, you could be an engineer, or you could be a grandma. You're going to find a lot of very informative storytelling, a lot of parables, a lot of wisdom, and things that I collected over many, many years, which I put down in the book. And it's available on Amazon, hardcover, audible.com, various different languages. And I think people would, if they liked what we talked about today, but if you want it to be represented in a very colorful storytelling format between two friends, it's not a textbook. I think you'll find a lot of benefit. And you read it, so you can make your own judgment on that.
Yeah, yeah. No, I really enjoyed it. Yeah, it was good. Learned a lot. Okay, Gianni, if people want to learn more about you, how can they reach you? Where can they find you?
Well, my Twitter handle is Gianni Kov, which you can link to other people, and you can subscribe to my very periodic, how shall I say, propaganda that I put out once in a while when something interesting comes across the internet sphere that I've seen, or articles that I will write. But I think for the most part, people can just go on Twitter and follow me that way, and I always post different things that are interesting, so they can do it that way.
Okay, thank you very much, Gianni. Any ending thoughts before we finish up?
No, I think just people should be hopefully fascinated by not only the magnificence of what electrification is, but to now go and understand a little bit more. That's the future. So you can encourage your kids to maybe push them towards understanding something in the design, innovation, engineering, electrical engineering, but certainly to have a basic understanding, I think is also going to be good for the bank account. And people can look at investing in certain areas, and we have a company called Copper Bank, which people can look at. They can look at the website. It's an optionality play for copper. So we've purchased a bunch of projects that are uneconomic at today's copper price, but it's like an optionality play for the future where the economic value of these deposits increases dramatically for every 25 cents the copper price goes higher. It's a huge optionality, and most importantly, there's no time expiry because we own the real estate. So that's something they can look at, and the website is copperbankcorp.com. It is listed. You can buy the shares on the OTC in the United States, in Canada, and in Frankfurt. And that's also another very good video archive where in our energy zone on the website, the Copperbank website, you'll find a lot of very informative videos, including a video interview that the most recent one I did is the first video, so they can view that at their own leisure.
Okay. Thank you very much, Gianni.
Okay, thank you.